Jesus and his disciples boarded the boat again on their return journey and ended up in his neck of the woods. As soon as they landed, there was a man who could not lift a finger lying on his bed at Jesus' feet. His friends, who had heard that Jesus was in town, brought both man and his bed and deposited them at the feet of the healer. When Jesus looked, he didn't see a man paralyzed. He saw the faith of friends who wanted their buddy to be well and whole. He saw fearless faith, faith that could not be denied, delayed, or deprived, faith that walked with feet of courage. He saw determination in action. Jesus saw hope in the eyes of these friends and faith in their actions, and he was impressed. Have you noticed that one thing that never ceased to impress Jesus was faith demonstrated, not just confessed? Whenever the action of someone highlighted their faith, Jesus would marvel. Even till date, I am sure that every time our faith shows up and stands out, Jesus notices. Whenever small faith stands against great odds, Jesus is impressed. Get your journal, please. How have your actions shown your faith in your walk so far? Actions, they say, speak louder than words. The work of faith will always be empty confessions. Our steps of faith will always rise above contrary voices that are trying to silence us. How can you put your faith into action? James said that faith without works is dead, as in faith that is not active is not living. Dormant faith is not helpful. Our faith needs to be alive and visible because faith is life-giving. Oh God, may we be a people of living and active faith. May we be a people who live what we believe. How can you ensure that your words line up with your faith? Don't forget to pen these thoughts in your journal. Jesus turned to the man lying at his feet and said, "Friend, your sin account is cleared. You are free." What? Huffing and puffing, the minds of some religious nincompoop were rioting. How dare he say that? Who but God can clear anyone's sin account? Who does he think he is, poking his nose into God's business? One thought, "I am offended." The other looked at him and confirmed, "God is insulted." But they said nothing to Jesus. Jesus knew the riots raging in their minds and saw the smoke shooting out of their inflamed noses. So he asked, "Why all that internal combustion? You are at risk of implosion. God has all power and he doesn't take the easy way out. He doesn't just trim a dead tree. He goes for the root first. Then he plants a new one because he is God of the living, not a nurse for the dead." And that needed to be said so y'all will know that God's Son understands how the Father operates. He turned to the man in bed and said, "Take your bed back to your room where it belongs." Immediately, the man who was carried in on his bed jumped up and carried his bed out of the place. Yes, right before a gawking crowd, right under the nose of those who were huffing and puffing and could do nothing for themselves or anyone else for that matter. The crowd broke into a cheer as the man they watched carried in not long ago turned around and walked out with the bed that carried him. What wonder! What a miracle! If you were there on that day, on which side will you be standing? among the religious nincompoops whose heads were full of God's law while their hearts were empty of compassion. Or among the amazed crowd that recognized that a miracle had happened and it had to be God at work. Among those who went home offended, or among those who went to bed that night believing that God has come among us to do what has never before been done. I hope that as life comes at you, that you will always be sensitive to identify and courageous to choose God's side in everything at every time. Jesus continued the journey with his disciples. Along the way, they passed the tax office. Jesus saw a man inside, buried in his calculations, and he paused. Unhurried, he waited until the man sensed his presence and lifted up his head. The eyes of Matthew, the tax collector, met the eyes of the Messiah in flesh and blood. Matthew had no idea who Jesus was, but he knew this man knew too much about his miscalculations and could make a public show of him before everyone around. Matthew could utter not a word in self-defense before the man who saw through his heart and dubious dealings. But Jesus said not a word in judgment. Without words, Jesus allowed the man to see something nobody else in the crowd that day could see. And goodness, was Matthew grateful for the God that knows our past and yet does not frown at us in condemnation for our countless failures. The God that knows our deepest secrets and doesn't blast it for the world to know how fallen and filthy we are. Instead, he protects us from the world and its harsh and irredeemable judgment. He keeps our secrets between us and him, not to encourage us to continue in the mess, but to gently and kindly guide us like little children out of darkness into his glorious light. As the man stared up to the Savior, Jesus sensed his helpless surrender. Nobody in the crowd that day knew the exchange that transpired between the man in the office looking out and the man standing outside looking in. But the tax man understood something. So much so that as soon as Jesus said to him, "Follow me," he knew his time in the tax office was done. Quickly, he packed up and followed Jesus and his friends. Jesus didn't take him to the stream to wash up his filthy miscalculations of many years. He didn't take him to church or to some holy place. In fact, Jesus allowed that dubious fellow to lead him to his home, the house of a sinner. And it wasn't a prayer meeting they had that day. It was a party. That sinner invited his fellow sinners, partners in crime, and their families, and together with Jesus, they had a ball. Nobody was judged or condemned. They knew that Jesus was as righteous as they were steeped in their sinfulness. But that day, they all ate and drank and had the time of their life. Voluntarily, these sinners were confessing and turning their lives over to Jesus. Each person and their household were bowing their hearts in surrender to his lordship. All of those people that sinful Matthew gathered on that fateful day pledged allegiance to Jesus. While across the street, the religious bigots had gathered like vultures around a corpse, muttering under their breath and pointing fingers, accusing Jesus of making sinners feel good about themselves. Some disciples went across to find out what that gathering and muttering and finger pointing was all about. and the religious nincompoops pounced on them, condemning the disciples and their master for mingling with a people that should be rejected for their sinfulness. The disciples escaped and returned to tell Jesus what the hula-baloo across the street was all about, and he smiled. He already knew. In no rush, he completed the work he had started with Matthew and his friends and headed out. On his way, he paused to address the entitled religionists. Those who don't think they are sick don't need a doctor, but those who know they are sick are happy to welcome the doctor and to take whatever he prescribes. Since y'all don't need a doctor, why are you stalking me and loitering everywhere I go? I remember being a singles pastor in a church. We formed an evangelism group and would go out in the evenings to the streets where prostitutes hang out, waiting to be picked up by their clients. We would show up in our immaculate t-shirts with bold prints of "Say no to prostitution and abortion" in front and behind, and our big Bibles in our hands. As we approached, those girls tried to get out of our way. They clearly wanted nothing to do with us. We were too zealous to save those sinners that we refused to be discouraged. But there was very little fruit to show for all our zeal. Years later, I was living in another city and had friends who were friends with some of these girls that were into prostitution. By then, I was a more matured Christian who had divorced religion for good and was enjoying my relationship with God and with people. I became friends with these girls. I learned their stories. I felt their pain, and I learned to stand up for them whenever people tried to take advantage of them. They got to know me and about my faith, and I was grateful to be a light they could see through without feeling judged or condemned. I felt privileged to be able to pray for and with some of them, to listen when they needed to vent, and lend a shoulder when they wanted to cry, to give them hope and share the help I found through God, who is always there for us, no matter where we have been or what we have been through. If I have to name the places that I am grateful for the opportunity to shine the light of Jesus, it was while sitting and chatting and hanging out and standing up for these girls I once looked down upon. As I modeled my faith and life after Christ, I would seek what Jesus would do in every situation and do just the same. And it wasn't that hard. In fact, being like Jesus is way easier than the life of religion that looked down on anyone who wasn't where we were or where we think they should be. Just finding the footprints of Jesus and planting my feet therein so I could walk as he walked has enabled me to reach out and touch so many people that I may never have been able to access. So many people that would never show up in church. So many people that would never listen to a preacher. And every time I am honored to shine the light of Christ to one of these for whom Christ died. I can hear Jesus whispering to me, "Well done, Glory. Good job, girl." And nothing brings me more joy. Nothing like seeing that smile on the face of Jesus as I allow him to love those we consider unlovable or hard to love through my sincere surrender and trusting obedience. And guess what? While we heard no good thing about those critical religious leaders of those days who ganged up to crucify Christ, that sinful Matthew became one of the disciples of Jesus and documented the first book of the gospel. Talk about the eternal transformative power of love, God's love for us. A few more questions for you and your journal. Who do you consider difficult to love? Why is it hard for you to love them? What do you think Jesus will do if he was wearing your shoes? If you can find out what Jesus will do for them and do likewise, you will be a good and faithful servant of our Lord and a model of his love. May you find grace today to go truly in his name, to live as he lived, to talk as he talked, walk as he walked among us, and love like he loved, and forever will love us all. Check out the links and scriptures below for additional help. Feel free to share your thoughts and answers in the comments. Be inspired. You are a star, and it's your time to shine. Don't forget to subscribe and share this with family and friends. Join me in the next video, still on this series of divine interruption, as we explore the question, are you really the one?